50,000 people watched Michael Jackson freeze on stage at Wembley Stadium. What was supposed to be the crown jewel of his Bad World Tour became the night the king of pop nearly shattered in front of half of London. It was July 16th, 1988, and the sold-out crowd was expecting moonwalks, sequin gloves, and pure magic. Instead, they witnessed something that had never happened in pop music history. Michael Jackson, the most electrifying performer on earth, standing motionless at center stage for 10 excruciating minutes. Unable to move, unable to sing, unable to be the superstar they came to see. But what happened next would prove that sometimes the most powerful moments aren't about perfect performance, they're about perfect humanity. By July 1988, Michael Jackson was drowning in his own success. The Bad World Tour was breaking every record imaginable. Largest grossing tour in history, fastest selling tickets, most elaborate stage production ever conceived. But behind the glittering facade of triumph, Michael was struggling with a weight that would have crushed anyone else. The impossible burden of being perfect. The pressure wasn't just about the music anymore. Every move Michael made was dissected by tabloids hungry for scandal. Recent allegations and media storms had painted him as eccentric, strange, different. The man who had once been America's sweetheart was now treated like a curiosity, and he felt it deeply. They don't see Michael, he confided to his longtime friend and choreographer Vincent Patterson. They see a headline. The perfectionism that had driven Michael to the top was now becoming his prison. Every concert had to be flawless, every note perfect, every dance move precise. He would rehearse for hours beyond what anyone else demanded, pushing his band and dancers to exhaustion. "It's not good enough," became his constant refrain during rehearsals. Nothing ever was. Wembley Stadium represented the ultimate test. 7 nights at the venue that had hosted Live Aid, where legends were made and careers were defined. The British press was notoriously brutal, and Michael knew they would be watching for any sign of weakness. "Wembley isn't just a concert," he told his manager Frank DeLeo. "It's where they decide if you belong with the greats or not." The anxiety had been building for weeks. Michael's usual pre-show meditation sessions were lasting longer. His ritual of listening to classical music before taking the stage had expanded from 30 minutes to over an hour. The crew noticed he was asking more questions about the technical setup, double-checking details he'd never worried about before. That July evening in London, as 50,000 fans gathered outside Wembley Stadium, Michael stood in his dressing room, staring at his reflection. The sequin jacket hung perfectly. The single white glove was positioned just right, but the man wearing them felt anything but ready. The roar of the crowd filtering through the stadium walls sounded different somehow. Not like celebration, but like expectation. Tonight wasn't just another show. Tonight was the night when the pressure of perfection would finally demand its price. The atmosphere backstage at Wembley was electric, but something felt off. The usual pre-show energy that buzzed through Michael's crew was tinged with concern. His band members, who had performed with him for years, exchanged worried glances as they completed their final soundchecks. "He's been in there for 2 hours," whispered keyboardist Greg Phillinganes to guitarist Jennifer Batten. Michael's dressing room door had remained closed since 6 p.m., with only his security detail allowed inside. Usually, Michael would be moving around backstage by now, warming up with the dancers, joking with the crew, building the collective energy that made his shows legendary. Inside that dressing room, Michael's pre-show rituals had taken on an almost desperate quality. He typically spent 45 minutes in meditation and vocal warm-ups. Tonight, he'd been going through the same exercises for over an hour, starting and stopping, never satisfied. His personal assistant noticed he'd changed outfits 3 times, something he'd never done before. "Michael, we need to run through the opening sequence," called out choreographer Travis Payne through the door. But instead of his usual enthusiastic response, there was only silence. Outside, Wembley Stadium was a cauldron of anticipation. 50,000 fans had traveled from across Europe to witness what many considered the greatest live performer of their generation. The merchandise stands were overwhelmed. The energy was so intense that security guards reported feeling the stadium literally vibrating from the crowd's excitement. "You can feel it in the walls," said longtime crew member Gary Archer. "It's like the building itself is alive with expectation." But that expectation was exactly what was weighing on Michael. Through his dressing room speakers, he could hear the opening acts finishing their sets, knowing that each passing minute brought him closer to the moment when he'd have to deliver perfection to those 50,000 people. His backup dancers, Lavelle Smith Jr. and the rest of the crew, had been ready for 30 minutes. They kept running through the opening choreography, but without Michael, it felt hollow. "Something's different tonight," Lavelle said to the others. "I've never seen him this quiet before a show." At 8:45 p.m., 15 minutes before showtime, Frank DeLeo knocked on Michael's door. "Michael, we need to move to positions." The response came as barely a whisper, "I know." When Michael finally emerged from his dressing room, his usual radiant pre-show glow was replaced by something his crew had never seen before: raw vulnerability. His hands were trembling slightly as he adjusted his glove. "You got this, boss," said his longtime bodyguard Bill Bray, the same words he'd said before hundreds of shows. For the first time anyone could remember, Michael looked uncertain. Outside, 50,000 voices began chanting his name. Inside, the King of Pop was about to face his greatest fear: the possibility of letting them all down. When the lights dimmed at Wembley Stadium, 50,000 people erupted into a roar that could be heard for miles across London. The opening notes of "Wanna Be Startin' Somethin'" began to pulse through the massive sound system, and suddenly, there he was, Michael Jackson, emerging from beneath the stage in a burst of smoke and light. For those first precious moments, everything seemed perfect. Michael hit his mark, struck his signature pose, and the crowd went absolutely wild. His trademark lean sent waves of screams across the stadium. The moonwalk during the opening number was flawless. His spins were precise, and his energy seemed to match the electricity in the air. The band was locked in tight. Jennifer Batten's guitar riffs were crisp and powerful. The backup dancers moved like extensions of Michael's own body. From the audience's perspective, this was vintage Michael Jackson, the King of Pop at his absolute peak. But as the opening song concluded, and the band prepared to transition into Billie Jean, something shifted. Michael walked to center stage as he had thousands of times before, positioning himself directly under the main spotlight. The crowd's anticipation reached the crest. They knew what was coming. This was the moment when Michael would typically command the stage with his most iconic performance. Instead, he stopped walking. At first, it looked intentional. Michael was known for dramatic pauses, for building tension before explosive moments. The band continued their intro, waiting for his cue to launch into the full arrangement. But the cue never came. Michael stood motionless at center stage, his breathing becoming rapid and shallow. The stadium lights, which he'd performed under countless times, suddenly felt unbearably bright and hot. The roar of 50,000 voices transformed from energy into an overwhelming wall of sound that seemed to crash down on him. His signature gloved hand began to shake. His chest felt tight, like he couldn't get enough air. The sea of faces stretching to the back of Wembley Stadium suddenly looked infinite, each pair of eyes expecting perfection he wasn't sure he could deliver. "What's happening?" Jennifer Batten whispered to keyboardist Greg Phillinganes, while continuing to play the intro loop. They'd never seen Michael freeze like this before. The backup dancers maintained their positions, thinking this might be some new artistic choice. But as 10 seconds became 20, then 30, their concerned glances toward each other became more obvious. In the sound booth, the crew began to panic. "Is his mic working?" someone called out. "Is he getting a cue?" But the technical team knew Everything was functioning perfectly. This wasn't a technical problem. From the audience, the first few rows began to sense something was wrong. The excited chatter started to shift. Why isn't he moving? A fan near the front asked her friend, "Is this part of the show?" Michael remained frozen at center stage, trapped in his own mind. While 50,000 people watched the most famous performer in the world struggle with something they couldn't understand. The music continued to loop, waiting for a moment that seemed like it might never come. Inside Michael's mind, time had stopped. The stadium's roar had become a deafening static that made it impossible to think clearly. Every face in the crowd seemed to be staring directly at him, waiting, expecting, demanding the magic he wasn't sure he could deliver. His chest felt tight, his breathing shallow, and his legs felt like they were made of concrete. "Move," he told himself desperately. "Just move. Just sing. Do what you've done 1,000 times before." But his body wouldn't respond. The perfectionist, who had spent his entire life in control of every gesture, every note, every movement, was completely paralyzed by his own expectations. The lights above felt like they were burning through him. The sequin jacket that usually made him feel invincible now felt suffocating. Even the familiar weight of his glove seemed foreign and wrong. This was supposed to be his sanctuary, the stage where he felt most alive. But tonight it felt like a prison. Meanwhile, the audience was experiencing their own journey. The initial excitement was giving way to confusion. In section 12, a young woman named Sarah Collins turned to her boyfriend. "Something's not right," she whispered. "He's just standing there." The band continued playing the intro to Billie Jean in a loop, hoping Michael would snap out of whatever was happening. Greg Phillinganes later described those minutes as the longest of my career. "We didn't know whether to keep playing or stop. We didn't know how to help." As the minutes stretched on, different sections of the stadium began to process what they were witnessing differently. Some fans, thinking this was an artistic choice, waited patiently. Others grew restless, checking their watches and murmuring to each other. But a small group near the front began to understand something else entirely. Emma Harrison, sitting in the third row, was a nurse at St. Mary's Hospital in London. She recognized the signs immediately. "He's having a panic attack," she told her sister. "Look at his breathing. Look at his hands. He's terrified." Emma did something that would change everything. She stood up slowly, not with the aggressive energy of a demanding fan, but with the gentle presence of someone offering help. She began to clap, not the wild, screaming applause typical of a Michael Jackson concert, but slow, steady, supportive clapping. "It's okay, Michael," she called out, her voice carrying clearly in the moment of relative quiet. "Take your time. We're here for you." Her words seemed to ripple outward. The people around her heard what she said and saw what she was doing. They looked back at the stage and suddenly understood what they were really witnessing. Not a performance gone wrong, but a human being in crisis. One by one, others began to stand and join Emma's gentle applause. "We love you, Michael," called out someone from section 8. "Just breathe," shouted another fan from across the stadium. The demanding energy of 50,000 people expecting entertainment was slowly transforming into something entirely different. 50,000 people offering support. The shift wasn't immediate or universal, but it was real, and it was growing, spreading through Wembley Stadium like a wave of compassion. On stage, Michael was still trapped in his paralysis, but something was beginning to change in the energy around him. The hostile expectation he'd been feeling was softening into something he'd never experienced from an audience before: unconditional acceptance. What happened next at Wembley Stadium was nothing short of miraculous. Emma Harrison's gentle applause and words of encouragement had sparked something that no one could have planned or predicted. Like ripples spreading across a pond, the message of support began to flow through the massive arena. Section by section, the transformation spread. In the upper tiers, fans who couldn't clearly see what was happening on stage heard the change in energy below, and instinctively joined in. The aggressive chants of "Michael, Michael," that typically demanded performance shifted to something softer. "We love you, Michael. Take your time." A group of teenagers in Section 15 began singing "We Are the World" quietly, their voices carrying across the stadium. Others picked up the melody, not as a demand for entertainment, but as an offering of solidarity. The song that Michael had helped create to heal the world was now being sung back to him in his moment of need. "You don't have to be perfect for us," called out a man from the stands, his voice carrying clearly in the unusual quiet. "You just have to be you." The most remarkable thing was how organic it all felt. There was no coordination, no plan, no leader directing this response. 50,000 strangers were somehow reading each other's hearts and responding as one entity focused on healing rather than entertainment. On stage, Michael was still struggling with his panic attack, but the energy washing over him was beginning to penetrate his paralysis. The harsh expectation that had frozen him was being replaced by something he'd rarely experienced from an audience: unconditional love. "They're not leaving," he thought, amazement breaking through his fear. Throughout his career, Michael had been terrified of disappointing people, of not living up to their expectations. But these people weren't demanding anything from him. They were offering everything to him. His breathing began to slow slightly. The crushing weight on his chest started to ease just a fraction. For the first time in those 10 minutes, Michael lifted his head and really looked at the crowd. Instead of 50,000 judges waiting to critique his performance, he saw 50,000 people who cared about him as a human being. Guitarist Jennifer Batten noticed the subtle change first. "I think he's coming back," she whispered to the other band members, who had maintained their positions, ready to support him whenever he was ready. The backup dancers, led by Lavelle Smith Jr., had remained perfectly still, but their faces showed nothing but love and support for their friend and leader. They weren't worried about the show or the timing or the technical aspects. They were worried about Michael. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, Michael took a small step toward the microphone. The crowd, sensing the shift, maintained their supportive energy but grew quieter, giving him space to find his way back. Security Chief Bill Bray, watching from the side of the stage, later said, "In that moment, I saw something I'd never seen before. I saw 50,000 people choose love over disappointment. It was the most beautiful thing I've ever witnessed." Michael was still shaky, still vulnerable, but he was no longer alone in his crisis. He was surrounded by an ocean of compassion that was giving him the strength to take one more step toward the microphone. When Michael finally reached the microphone, Wembley Stadium fell into a silence more profound than any he'd ever experienced. 50,000 people held their breath, waiting not for entertainment, but to witness whatever truth was about to emerge from the man they'd just helped heal. "I need to tell you something," Michael said, his voice barely above a whisper but carrying clearly through the massive sound system. His usual stage confidence was gone, replaced by raw, unfiltered honesty. "I came out here tonight, thinking I had to be perfect for you, thinking I had to be this thing that everyone expects me to be." The vulnerability in his voice was unlike anything his fans had ever heard from him. This wasn't the polished performer they knew from music videos and carefully choreographed shows. This was simply Michael, scared, grateful, and completely human. "But you just taught me something," he continued, his voice growing stronger. "You taught me that you don't need me to be perfect. You just need me to be real." What happened next was unprecedented in Michael Jackson's career. Instead of launching into his planned high-energy set with elaborate choreography and special effects, he walked over to the piano positioned at stage left. His band members exchanged glances. This wasn't in any of their rehearsals. "I want to sing you something," Michael said, settling onto the piano bench. "Not because it's on the set list, not because it's what you paid to see, but because it's what's in my heart right now." He began playing a simple melody on the piano, something gentle and intimate that none of his crew had heard before. It seemed to be flowing directly from his emotions in that moment. When he began to sing, it wasn't with his usual dynamic performance voice, but with the tender, conversational tone of someone sharing a secret with close friends. The song was improvised, a heartfelt expression of gratitude mixed with his own fears and hopes. The 50,000 people in the audience felt like they were witnessing something sacred, a moment of pure artistic creation, born from vulnerability and love. "I've been so afraid of letting you down," he sang softly, "but you caught me when I fell." The usual screaming and cheering that accompanied Michael's performances was replaced by something more profound, complete, reverent attention. People were crying. Others were holding hands with strangers. The massive stadium somehow felt intimate, like a living room where friends were sharing their deepest truths. Jennifer Batten later described it as the most powerful performance I've ever been part of. "We weren't backing a superstar anymore. We were supporting a human being, sharing his soul." When Michael finished the impromptu song, the applause was different too. It wasn't the wild celebration of a great show. It was the grateful acknowledgement of a gift received. People weren't just clapping for entertainment. They were expressing their love for someone who had trusted them with his vulnerability. "Thank you for catching me," Michael said simply. And in that moment, both he and his audience understood that they had experienced something that transcended typical performer-audience relationships. They had shared a moment of pure human connection that would stay with them forever. The incident at Wembley Stadium didn't just change that one night. It transformed Michael Jackson's entire approach to performing. For the remaining dates of the Bad World Tour, something fundamental had shifted. The perfectionist, who had once demanded 30 takes of every dance move, began incorporating moments of spontaneous vulnerability into his shows. After Wembley, Michael was different, recalled tour manager Frank DeLeo. He started talking to audiences more, sharing stories, being present with them instead of just performing for them. It was like he'd discovered a new instrument, his own humanity. The media response was initially divided. Some tabloids tried to frame the incident as a breakdown, questioning Michael's mental state and professional reliability. But their narrative couldn't compete with the thousands of fans who had been there that night and knew what they had experienced. Social media didn't exist in 1988, but fan networks around the world spread a different story, one of compassion, connection, and the power of collective love. "The British press tried to make it seem like he was falling apart," said longtime fan Margaret Stevens, who had traveled from Manchester to attend. "But everyone who was actually there knew we'd witnessed something beautiful. We'd seen Michael Jackson become real, and it was more powerful than any moonwalk." Bootleg recordings of that night became some of the most treasured items in fan collections, not for their musical perfection, but for their emotional authenticity. The moment when Michael addressed the crowd, the improvised piano performance, the sound of 50,000 people responding with love instead of demands, these became legendary among those who understood that they'd witnessed something unprecedented. The impact rippled throughout the music industry. Other artists began to take note of what had happened at Wembley and started questioning their own relationships with perfectionism and audience expectations. Bruce Springsteen later said in interviews that hearing about Michael's experience made him rethink his own approach to live performance. "What Michael showed us that night," said music critic John Pareles, "is that audiences don't just want to see perfection, they want to see truth. They want to connect with the human being behind the superstar." For Michael personally, the Wembley incident became a turning point in how he viewed his career and his relationship with his fans. He began incorporating acoustic segments into his later tours, moments where he would sit at the piano or guitar and share more intimate performances. The wall between Michael Jackson the icon and Michael Jackson the person had been permanently lowered. Years later, when other artists faced similar moments of vulnerability on stage, the Wembley incident was often referenced as proof that authenticity, could triumph over perfection. It became a touchstone for understanding that the most powerful moments in live performance often come not from flawless execution, but from genuine human connection. The legacy of that July night in 1988 extended far beyond entertainment. It demonstrated that when someone shows vulnerability, the human response can be compassion rather than judgment. It proved that 50,000 strangers could act as one healing force when someone needed support. Today, whenever performers struggle with anxiety, perfectionism, or the pressure of public expectations, the story of Wembley serves as a reminder. Sometimes our greatest moments of connection come not when we're strongest, but when we're brave enough to be vulnerable. And sometimes the most powerful thing an audience can do is not demand a perfect show, but offer perfect love.